So without further ado, let's hear from William Smith, who's at the GEMR, Global Monitoring Report, which, as I say, has got a long and illustrious history now. So each year it takes a theme, and the current year was a theme of accountability, and it meshes very well, I think, with what we've heard from the WDR about the need to use metrics in one way or another to increase accountability. So without further ado, you've got 25 minutes.
Thank you, Keith. So I'm William Smith. I'm a senior policy analyst at the report. And when we were putting this panel together, we were quite excited to kind of start with the World Bank and then come to the GEM report, knowing that the World Bank is focusing on learning and the crisis there, and then our focus on accountability is often put forward. When we talk about the challenges in education, you hear, oh, we need more accountability to fix that. We need more accountability to fix that. And one of the goals of this report is to try to nuance that argument a little bit and say, okay, well, what accountability works? And when does it work? And in what context does it work? Instead of just, we need more accountability. So, as one of the mandates of the Global Education Monitoring Report is monitoring SDG 4. So we look well beyond 4.1 in learning, we look at all these other outcomes. And we see that there's challenges throughout the spectrum of education. So we know that 100 million youth cannot read, but we also know that 1 in 7 primary teachers aren't trained. We know that aid is stagnated. We knew that 4 of 5 primary schools in sub-Saharan Africa do not have electricity. And so there are problems with inputs, outcomes, and outputs throughout education. So what do we do for this report? So this report starts by looking at a bunch of different actors, and the WDRs talked about, okay, we need those actors to align, and we talk about more of these actors are interdependent on each other. So we look at all these different education actors, going from governments to schools, to parents and students, to international organizations, and we start with, well, how are they currently held to account? Before we evaluate whether or not that's effective, what are their responsibilities and how are they currently held to account? So accountability overall has increased, or the call for accountability has increased over time for a lot of different factors. So we see increased decentralization leading to greater calls for accountability. We see challenges in the in public sector leading for, okay, what are we going to do about public sector? We see that it's not doing what it needs to for our students and our children. We also see increased information, calling for more transparency. So a lot of these things are pushing accountability, and accountability is being pushed sometimes down to the local level to the teachers, parents, and students themselves. So what I'm going to start with is a brief video that kind of describes some of these connections. Okay. Hopefully.
All countries have committed to achieve equitable quality education by the year 2030. Governments are responsible for achieving this goal, but others have responsibilities too. Schools, teachers, parents and students, international organizations, private sector. Unfortunately, the challenge is large. Millions are not going to school, and many more are leaving school not having learned enough. This year's Global Education Monitoring Report shows how accountability can help. Accountability helps show who is responsible for what and how problems can be fixed. Governments are held to account by judges, parliamentarians, auditors, ombudsmen, and international organizations. But we all have the power to hold governments to account. The press, elections, and protests all play an important role. Schools must provide a safe and supportive learning environment. Governments can regulate, accredit, inspect, and monitor them. Parents can exercise control by taking part in school management or by choosing ways to educate their child. Teachers teach, but they also do much more. They are guided by ethical codes. Evaluators observe them. Inspectors scrutinize them. Other teachers in the community also sometimes monitor their work. Parents must ensure students go to school well prepared. In some countries, they can be punished if they do not. Students must not disrupt other students' ability to learn and teachers' ability to teach. International organizations help determine our global goals, and member states can question their actions. Donors promise aid. Reporting and scrutiny can expose those falling short of their commitments. The private sector is increasingly influential. Regulations, codes of conduct, transparent contracts, and media scrutiny ensure private actors work for the greater good. Accountability matters. It really matters. But accountability systems don't always work. They can be unaffordable for poorer countries. If badly designed, they penalize the poorest, erode teacher motivation, and narrow the curriculum. The GM report shows what is needed. Reporting to international bodies, auditing the budget, monitoring, and regulating. Transparency is crucial. Clear and accessible information shows who's responsible for what is being achieved, and when systems break down. Trust is more effective than penalty. Punishing those who don't achieve strong education results is counterproductive. What we need is to build capacity and to provide resources. We need adequate information about the way education systems are working, and for there to be genuine commitment. Let's get accountability right.
There you go. Okay, so as you saw from the video, what we do in the full report is go through the various actors and we ask, okay, well, what are their responsibilities in general across countries? How are they held to account? And then does that accountability approach prove effective towards a larger goal? So before we start the report, we have to define what is accountability. And we see accountability as a process that helps shows who's responsible for what and how they can meet their commitments. So it's important that we recognize accountability is a process towards something. You need to have a general aim to accountability in order to evaluate it. Across the report, we see a few key truths. So ambitious education outcomes, such as meeting the SDG goals or even student learning, relies on multiple actors fulfilling their shared responsibility. So education and the large aims of education are effectively a shared responsibility. And while these responsibilities can be shared, accountability cannot be shared. So in order for accountability to be effective, it needs to be attached to an individual responsibility that that individual has the capacity to actually fulfill. So therefore, people should not be held accountable for outcomes beyond their control. For instance, teachers should not be held solely accountable for student test scores, which are often beyond their control. Accountability also needs to be flexible. Accountability mechanisms may be effective in some contexts and in some countries and detrimental in others. So when we think about, regardless of the approach, what's needed to be effective. So this is one of my favorite diagrams from the report. And so we see here, we have an aim for accountability. So here it's the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We have our actors, and there's multiple actors, or these kind of cogs here. But the main actor starts with government, schools, and teachers. And these are the frontline providers for education. But we have others, and we can continue to build out our machinery here. We know that these actors all work within certain context. So we need to keep that context into consideration because the context in which they work often determines which mechanism or which accountability approach is going to be effective. So we need to make sure we understand the economic, social, and political context, but also how is trust seen in the country? Who's trusted? Is the government trusted? Are the teachers trusted? Is the teacher union trusted? Do we trust the parents? So each of these actors, in order to actually have their effort mean something, they need to be equipped with this enabling environment. And we talk about 4 parts of the enabling environment. So if we're going to hold teachers to account, they need to have information on what they're responsible for. If they don't know they're responsible for something, you can't hold them accountable for that. They need to be motivated. And this is often one of the bigger challenges across all accountability. It's oftentimes a purpose for accountability is to push a behavior and try to figure out what that motivational lever is. So they need to have the capacity to fulfill their responsibilities and obviously the resources as well. So without those, none of these gears are going to move. And all of them have to move to actually get to these larger goals of education. So they're all related. So with this in mind and understanding that depending on the context, sometimes an approach might work and sometimes it may not, going to start with some general overarching thoughts that come from our conclusion. So first, we understand that because of the complexity of accountability and because it's really context specific, it needs to be applied with some degree of humility. And you can't just go out and parade it around and think that's going to solve all the problems. So, and there's some general, more beneficial approaches to accountability. So generally, legal accountability, providing regulations, rules, and laws, we understand this is the backbone of a well-functioning state. You need to have that. It's a minimum requirement almost. So social accountability can be useful, especially when community members have the capacity and resources. So social accountability is often this kind of bottom-up accountability. It's community members holding schools to account or citizens holding the government to account. And it works best when you're targeting easily observable behavior. So one of the better, or I guess more effective approaches to accountability is actually community members not evaluating whether or not teachers are learning, but whether or not teachers are showing up. Because that's something that you can identify. You can say, okay, was a teacher at that school that day? You can monitor that. And it doesn't take a lot of training or capacity. It's something that's easily observable and can be effective. And we see when we have social accountability programs that are targeting teacher attendance, oftentimes they tend to be very effective. So in social accountability, we also have an important role, not just for the general community, but for the media and civil society at large. The third type that tends to be generally beneficial is this professional or internal accountability. And so that creates a culture of shared professional norms, oftentimes through codes of conduct and other professional development opportunities, and it increases the trust. So when we think about trust and how it is interacts with accountability, we need to kind of think about trust at three levels. Okay? We think about trust of the person. And so oftentimes, so trust the person, trust of the profession, and trust in the process. And when we think about education, and when you talk to people in the community, they'll oftentimes say, oh, I really trust my teacher or my school. Okay? But I might not trust teachers overall. Right? Oftentimes there's a sense that my school is really good, but education is really poor in my country. And so there's often trust in the person, but not trust in the profession. And then within the profession, when we talk about teachers, we're talking about, do they trust the process? Because if they don't trust the process, their motivation for actually following through and their buy-in to this accountability mechanism is going to be quite low. So trust is important, and starting with some type of professional accountability where we're really focusing on building professional norms and doing professional development could increase trust in education. So these are some of the generally beneficial pieces. And then generally detrimental. So there's the things that may be effective in some areas, but overall, we say our countries should be quite cautious in implementing. So one is performance-based accountability. So this typically is seen as test-based accountability, so it's especially detrimental when focused on easily gamed outcomes and outcomes that are beyond the actor's control. We already talked about that with student test scores. Oftentimes, there's so many factors that go into something like a student test score. Holding a single actor accountable isn't effective. Often, when you have a blame focus, although most of the time performance-based accountability is looking at sanctions and rewards, most of the time, perception-wise at least, the sanctions outweigh the rewards. And so you end up with a blaming culture, and sometimes this is fueled by media attention as well. So a blame focus reduces trust and leads to other undesirable consequences. So be cautious when implementing market-based accountability. This creates competitive pressure, which generally further marginalizes disadvantaged parents and students, and can lead to increased segregation. So as UNESCO, we're most concerned with the equity dimension of the SDGs. So yes, perhaps market-based accountability may increase achievement for a certain sector of the population, but oftentimes it's leaving behind those students and those children we're most interested in. And then the third piece is be wary of unsustainable approaches. So oftentimes, because accountability is gaining popularity, it's being put forward by external funders, and the challenge is relying on external funding often doesn't have that type of intrinsic motivation, and it's a temporary funding solution. Also, we should be leery of accountability that only depends on temporary actors. So if we are only relying on parents, oftentimes parents' attention shifts once their children moves away from school. So we need to have complementary accountability approaches that aren't specifically relying on some of these undesirable funding and temporary actors. So those are some of the big overarching pieces. But when we think about accountability, regardless of all these actors, accountability starts with government. And when you talk about the right to education is that government is the primary duty bearer. So, and although all countries in the world have signed on to some type of right to education international legislation or treaty, only just over half of them, and only just over half of countries can citizens actually take their government to court for right to education violations. And in about 40% of countries, we've seen something like that happen. So, for instance, in Indonesia, some of these court cases have actually made a huge difference. So in Indonesia, the Constitutional Court basically mandated the government meet the funding level that was required in the Constitution, which was 20%. Okay. In India, the courts in India have put forth a school feeding program that basically increased access to school by over 300,000, specifically for girls. So when we talk about specific recommendations, because of the centrality of government, we're really focusing on how can we design a government system for effective accountability, and how can that be implemented? Okay, so let's start by, first we need to create a space. Okay, we need to create a welcoming space that allows multiple stakeholders to come together for meaningful engagement. So this involves not just the government, but oftentimes the parent associations, the teacher unions, the private sector, as Dion was pointing out. However, when we talk about consultation and education policy, a recent survey showed that over 60% of teacher unions are never or rarely consulted in something as important for their career and what happens in the schools as teaching material development. So additionally, countries need to involve parliamentary committees in reviewing education policy. In the United Kingdom, for instance, education policy changes are identical or nearly identical to the recommendations of the parliamentary committees. Okay. So next, we need to have some clarity. I mean, you saw the video, it can be a mess out there. There needs to be some clarity on who's responsible for what. If we can't identify individual responsibilities, accountability becomes quite a mess. And so one way to do that is to have clear lines of responsibilities and education plans, and to have transparent budgets where people are able to see what money is supposed to go where. However, when we did case studies for this report, we saw lots of challenges within clarity in education planning, especially in countries such as Bangladesh, Ghana, the Republic of Korea, and Vietnam. Budgets should be open to scrutiny, and external audit should be common. So for instance, in Chile and the Republic of Korea, online complaints were able to indicate areas for auditors' attention. And one of the big things we did here was, okay, we've got a plan, but how often are we making an annual review of that plan through a National Education Monitoring Report, and how often is that being made public? Okay, these reports oftentimes, especially from a social accountability perspective, are one way for the public to review what did the government do for us over the last year? What are they planning to do in the future? And so we looked at about 200 countries, and we looked to see whether or not they had a publicly available national monitoring report. And we found that from 2010, about 1 in 2 countries had one report. And we look at an annual report, it got down to about 1 in 6 countries. And so that's one of the things we're trying to push here. If we're going to have transparency and we're going to enable citizens to engage with the government, we need to have more open reporting on a regular basis. Okay. The government also needs to establish and monitor and enforce regulations and standards. Okay, but oftentimes these regulations are absent or ineffective. So in our look at at school regulations, we saw that about half of countries had no regulations on class sizes. Examples of having regulations but not really having them effective might be something in Cambodia. So Cambodia has regulations that, okay, you need to have electricity within schools, but obviously we know that doesn't happen so much. So in Cambodia, about 7%, let me make sure I got this number right. 7% of public primary schools and 24% of public secondary schools actually have access to electricity. So you can put regulations out there, it doesn't mean they're actually implemented in practice. But regulations are an important spot to start for both public and private sectors. And regulations need to be focused not just on quality, but also making sure we have equity in education. Okay, I mentioned this briefly before, but accountability should focus on building, not blaming. So there's a growing tendency to use student test scores to sanction schools or teachers, but instead of improving learning outcomes, these can undermine education quality and learning. So out of 11 countries that have this system of sanctioning and rewarding schools based on student outcomes, looking at PISA from 2003 to 2015, we saw that 5 actually saw some increase in learning and 6 saw a fall. Government should avoid punitive accountability systems for teachers and schools, especially those based on narrow performance measures, because it promotes unhealthy competition, narrows the curriculum, encourages teaching to the test, demotivates teachers, and disadvantages weaker students. For instance, in the Republic of Korea, where they have this punitive system in place, teachers have taken low-performing students on field trips during test days to make sure they're not included in the testing pool. So surveys in Australia show that 3 out of 4 teachers actually admit to teaching more to the test because of the accountability pressure put on them. Okay. Finally, for the design phase, governments need to allow for a democratic voice. This often includes encouraging a free press, which would encourage media scrutiny, and other avenues that citizens can formally voice their complaints, such as through ombudsman offices. So media scrutiny is important because it often highlights some of these independent reports that are going on and provides a watchdog role for the government. So in Uganda, schools that were closer to a newspaper outlet were actually more likely to receive school funding once that information was released to the public. Ombudsman has also been influential in promoting the right to education, for example, in Latin America, but they must be independent and have authority in the country to be effective. In Indonesia, the Ombudsman Office was essential in exposing fraud involving tests being sold to students and answers being shared on mobile phones. Okay. So regardless of the design, if the government doesn't have those enabling conditions, so if the government doesn't have the capacity and the resources and the political will or motivation to fulfill their mandate on the right to education, it's not going to be effective. So how do we implement a robust accountability system? First, we need to be transparent, provide relevant and timely information. This needs to improve investing in information that helps understand the education system. However, in Kenya, when we ask parents, once they're provided with student learning data, what do we do with this? Most of them don't know. So they have information, they don't understand what to do with it. We also need to make sure that the purpose of the data is to improve learning, and understand we're not trying to overburden individuals. So in England, 56% of teachers say that they have too much information, that it's overburdensome to them, and they don't really know what to do with all the information they have. Okay. Governments need to be committed by funding education. They should spend at least 4% of GDP on education or allocate 15% of the total government expenditure towards education. However, in 2015, 1 in 4 countries missed both of these benchmarks. And additionally, donor countries should allocate 0.7% of their national income to aid, with at least 10% of that to primary and secondary education. However, the share of aid to education has fallen for 6 years in a row. Additionally, we should be careful of results-based financing. This is similar to performance-based accountability, where we've got a link of sanctions and rewards towards a fairly narrow piece. We also see performance-based financing as oftentimes undermining this sense of country ownership and decreasing intrinsic motivation within the country. Finally, government should focus on building capacity. They need to build up strong institutions, including law enforcement and the judiciary to detect and deter corruption in education. In the European Union, education was a greater risk of corruption than a commonly seen corrupt sector such as construction. So you also need to train teachers and teacher evaluators and school inspectors. And you need to invest more in those who represent country and international organizations. One of the hardest things when we look at accountability is holding actors at the very top, at the global level, and at the very bottom accountable. Oftentimes the squeeze is towards the middle. So how are schools, teachers, and government to account? One thing that countries can do is provide more into holding institutions like UNESCO to account. So we have a role to play in this, we have a responsibility to play in this, and we should be held to account to make sure we do that. Finally, we know accountability isn't just about government. Very briefly, a lot of different actors, once again, kind of play part in monitoring the government. So teachers, through teacher unions, are regularly consulted in Mexico over policy with government. So they've been included and brought to the table in some countries. Students, as we've seen in protests in Chile and South Africa and elsewhere, can impact especially student fees and higher education. Parents have pushed towards change in some textbooks. This includes in South Africa and the United States, where parents were able to have climate change denial removed from textbooks. And civil society can play an important role. So in the Philippines, about 65% of textbook funding wasn't getting to the school level. So the government worked with NGOs on the ground. They looked at about 7,000 different textbook delivery points and were able to reduce the cost of textbook, or reduce the lost cost by 2/3. All right. Finally, the last thing is, if you're interested in more information here, I just want to set some of this. So you have at the back our summary, which is a very light version of the full report. So the full report's online. I didn't want to everybody breaking their back carrying that around. But specific to this report, we've done a couple of other things. So in the back of the full report is an accountability annex. And you'll get some information on how schools are held accountable through test scores. You'll get information on can your country, or can citizens in your country take the government to court for right to education violations. So there's about 7 different indicators specific to accountability that are there in the accountability annex in the back, next to kind of our stats tables. We also commissioned 26 country case studies, and if globally regionally representative case studies from around the world. We are doing a case study series blog right now, or blog series right now, and so what I have listed here are the country case studies that are out so far. So with Poland, Rwanda, and Tajikistan, I expect it to be coming out in the next week or so. And so if you're looking for country-specific or regionally specific information, that's one way to go. All right. With that said, I hope that everyone here, as well as the World Bank and the rest of the institutions working on these things, can help us in getting accountability right, and I hope that we can have a wonderful discussion coming forward. So thank you.